Chapter 6 The High-Low Middle Mechanism. Bertrand de Juvenal wrote many works over a long career, but I wish to concentrate on his most famous work, On Power, first published in 1945. Although he should justly be ranked alongside Carl Schmitt as one of the greatest political thinkers of the 20th century, his work was strangely neglected by Anglo-American political scientists, even as he was showered with honors in his native France. This is partly because he was dismissed as an eccentric amateur who lacked empirical rigor, and partly because, like the elite theorists, Juvenal was a severe critic of democracy, and this was unfashionable after World War II. Unlike the elite theorists, who had American champions in Arthur Livingston and James Burnham, Juvenal seemed to fall between the cracks, and his idiosyncrasies did not align him very easily with either liberals or conservatives. For example, Roy Pearce complained that in Juvenal's analysis, the real and significant differences between political systems are dissolved, and that he draws a false analogy between the New Deal in the United States and the Nazi regime in Germany. Pearce does not explain this and assumes it is self-evident as to why Juvenal was wrong. It is not self-evident to this reader. Like the elite theorists, Juvenal rejected the notion that society could ever be separated from the state. Power, by which he means central sovereign authority, is a constant in human affairs. In addition, breaking with the classical liberal tradition, he rejected the idea that the economy could ever exist free of politics, save in a Robinson Crusoe situation. Political action, as he defines it, is an essential and prior concomitant of economic activity, and he explicitly rejects the supposed division between sociology and politics. This insistence that there is no escape from politics also echoes Schmitt, although I should note that Juvenal does not quote him or any of the elite theorists. He was touching on many of the same truths though, and it is at times remarkable how similar his conclusions are to those of Mosca, Pareto, Michels or, indeed, of Schmitt. Gabriele Ciampini spotted this. For example, in Juvenal it seems that the voters do not choose the politicians, but on the contrary, that the latter are imposed on voters. By referring to political ideologies, the leadership of a party can impose on voters their political orientation and push them to elect candidates who do not deserve to be elected. As we will recall, this point exactly is made in Mosca. The truth is that the representative has himself elected by the voters. There is more than a hint of Michels when Juvenal says, there is no need to suppose that the persons chosen to govern are not in general perfectly representative men, exactly resembling their subjects. But when once they have been summoned to exercise of sovereign authority, their wills take on a new character and different force. While it is not clear if he ever read them, I am confident in asserting that Juvenal had instinctively absorbed the core tenets of elite theory, Mosca's law of the rulers and the ruled, Pareto's circulation of elites, and Michels's iron law of oligarchy. Juvenal's critique of democracy is rooted in two facts. First, he says that Montesquieu's separation of powers is a myth. Juvenal argues that the principle of separation of powers is actually unrealized. The government should be autonomous from the parliament if it wants to enjoy any substantial autonomy. The executive, which should be an expression of the popular will, is in fact directed by parties' leaders supporting it in parliament. Second, he says that democratic political systems are not immune to the secular trend in the growth of central governmental power. In fact, de Juvenal argues, they provide the broadest highway to tyranny that has ever existed. On this score, he laments the French Revolution. The power of the people was but a fiction in a regime which was for practical purposes a parliamentary sovereignty. But the fiction justified the blotting out of liberty on a scale never known before in Europe. His critique is virtually identical with that found in J. Del Talmon. The real people, or rather their leadership, once triumphant in their insurrection, become Rousseau's legislator, who surveys clearly the whole panorama, without being swayed by partial interests and passions, and shapes the young nation with the help of laws derived from his superior wisdom. He prepares it to will the general will. First comes the elimination of men and influences not of the people and not identified with the general will embodied in the newly established social contract of the revolution, then the re-education of the young nation to will the general will. Note here that the structure of power conforms exactly to Schmitt's model. Who decides? Who interprets? And, like Schmitt, Juvenal did not see democracy itself as different in formal terms from any previous power structures. Before outlining Juvenal's famous high-low middle mechanism, it is worth noting that he always maintained that he was a kind of liberal, insomuch as he was concerned throughout his work with liberty and the limiting of tyrannical power. At one point, in On Power, for example, he defends the traditional small business-owning bourgeois against centralizing power and its strategic use of inflation to drain the savings of the middle classes. Tyrannies made their appearance in step with the inflation which destroyed the independence and security of middle-class liberalism. However, he was also a severe critic of liberalism. In certain of his other works, which have not been translated into English, he condemns his generation, including himself, for its simplistic view of man as an individualistic and materialistic consumer, who can be made completely happy by rationalization of the economic system and the prevention of further wars. As Carl Slevin tells us, Juvenal was acutely aware of the problem of corporatocracy and liberalism's tendency to facilitate it. Liberalism, in its degenerate and anarchic form involving periodic crises and unemployment as in the USA, implies even greater subjection of the individual to economic forces than does communism. In addition, liberalism is no longer efficient in satisfying consumer demands through competition, for out of the struggle to survive have emerged gigantic corporations and trusts, which can effectively distort the market for their own ends. In opposition to the fundamental tenets of liberalism, enterprises threatened by the periodic depressions have called on the state for assistance, with great success, thereby making the consumer, in his guise as taxpayer, subsidize a system which offers no benefits in return. We will return to Juvenal's view of capitalism and its relationship to power shortly, but for now it is enough to say that although he was very far from being a doctrinaire free-market libertarian, he maintained that the scope for liberty rested in the middle class, people of independent means, who did not have to rely on the state. He had this in common with Samuel T. Francis, whom we will consider later. Let us turn now to outline Juvenal's model. As I have said, it is often called the high-low-middle mechanism and sometimes the patron theory of power. The idea at its most basic is that the high, the central power, makes an appeal of liberation and guarantee of security to the low, who are being oppressed by the middle. By patronizing the low, the high thus starts to drain away the power of the middle, thus accruing more power to itself. The clearest explication of this model is not found in On Power, where it emerges as a pattern throughout many historical episodes that the book considers, but in C. A. Bond's Nemesis, which does much to strip the model down to its core elements. Juvenal tends to use the terms of power, aristocracy, and the common people to define his three categories. However, the situation is somewhat more complicated than this, since he also seems to treat the independent middle class as being separate from the aristocracy with whom it might ally should power become tyrannical. Bond prefers to use the terms center, subsidiary, and a periphery. For this last group, periphery, Curtis Yarvin prefers clients as Marx's proletariat and lumpenproletariat, uneducated and/or dependent. I think the clients is a useful way to visualize the relationship of patronage between the high and the low. However, Bond's periphery captures something of the passive helplessness of the low. Without this alliance between a power center and the periphery itself is basically irrelevant. While the high and low categories can be easily understood, the high is the central sovereign power, the low are the lowest strata of the great mass of people, the middle requires further elaboration. Here there are some complications and nuances that are not readily understood. We cannot confuse the middle simply with the middle class. While Yarvin's term clients is useful to think about the low, his use of the term commoners, borrowed from Orwell, will not do for the middle. Juvenal consistently writes about the middle as an aristocracy which has its own centers of power or castles. Bond describes subsidiaries as follows: these subsidiary centers can be seen as delegates of the center, and act in its name and under its authority. Juvenal termed the elements that comprise this category social authorities, and by this he meant such entities as the nobility, families, corporations, trade unions, and any other institution within an order which can demand the obedience and allegiance of those within that order in conjunction with the central governing apparatus, or power. The key point to grasp is that to count as aristocratic or subsidiary, power must perceive a cell as a rival. Juvenal describes power as having an almost psychotic need to snuff out any challenge to its monopoly of control. This is the inner essence of power, which is the inevitable assailant of the social authorities and sucks their very lifeblood. And the more vigorous a particular power is, the more virile it is in the role of vampire. Power has a jealousy of any and every command, however small, which was not its own. Power could not tolerate such independence. For Juvenal this is a constant fact of human history and can be observed from the earliest tribal cultures right through to the present. He discusses variously the clan cell, the baronial cell, under the capitalistic cell, which divides into the industrial cell, under the financial cell. But no matter the period and specifics of the case, the structure remains the same. Power seeks to destroy the rival powers in the subsidiaries by patronizing clients. Power is the great leveler that sets out to curtail or eliminate every social authority that mediates between the individual and the state. However, there are two groups that Juvenal discusses that are missing in this tripartite model, the middle class in general, and a group we might call newly elevated bureaucrats. I am afraid that here I will have to introduce some complexity by mapping Juvenal's model onto the categories inherited from Mosca and Pareto, the governing elite, the non-governing elite and the governed. The middle class in general, who include people that are independently wealthy enough not to need the state but who do not command power sufficient to be an aristocrat, form the upper part of the governed. We might call this class petit bourgeois, or we might call them kulaks. They can ally with power, or they can ally with the subsidiaries. Should they ally with the latter, they too will become the target of power, which will brook no dissent. The newly elevated bureaucrats, meanwhile, become the lower stratum of the ruling class as non-governing elites. Let us take an example from Juvenal. The natural requirements of power made the fortunes of the common people. All those little peoples whom Dupont Ferrier shows are staffing the treasure court and the taxes court, no sooner found their niche in the state than they set about advancing their own fortunes along with their employers. At whose expense? The aristocrats. With a boldness born of obscurity, they encroached progressively on the taxing rights of the barons and transferred to the royal treasury the incomes of the great. As their invasions grew, the financial machine grew larger and more complicated. There might be new posts for their relations, they discovered new duties, so that whole families take their ease in a bureaucracy that grew continually in numbers and authority, spawning a whole hierarchy of underlings, deputies, clerks, registrars. So it was that everywhere the service of the state became the road to distinction, advancement, and authority for the common people. What a sight it is, the rise of the clerks, this swarming of busy bees who gradually devour the feudal splendor and leave it with nothing but its pomp and titles. Does it not leap to the eye that the state has made the fortunes of all these common people, just as they have made the states? Juvenal shared with Michel's, it seems, an absolute distaste for the career bureaucrat. It is important to note, however, that these bureaucrats are not the low or peripheries or clients, they are a key part of power itself on its march towards ever greater centralization. Should any of the institutions of these bureaucrats begin to develop power independently from the central power, then they become aristocrats, feudal nodes, who will in time draw the eye of Sauron. Let us examine a few of Juvenal's historical examples that showcase his model in action. So in England, when the greed of Henry VIII had fallen on the ecclesiastical authorities to get from their wealth the wherewithal to carry out his policies, the greater part of the monastic spoils stuck to the fingers of hands which had been held out to receive them. These spoils founded the fortunes of the nascent English capitalism. In this way new hives are forever being built, in which lie a new sort of energies. These will in time inspire the state of fresh orgies of covetousness. Here power, as vested in the king, Henry VIII, who let us not forget, was aided by skilled administrators such as Thomas Cromwell, crushes a subsidiary power, the Catholic Church, as a simple raid on its wealth. But in the process, he could not help but raise up a new group of people who would themselves later become aristocrats. This is why Juvenal described the state as a permanent revolution, since power's ceaseless quest to eliminate its rivals invariably must create new potential rivals in the process. Juvenal later considers the same pattern taking place after the Industrial Revolution. The industrialists had become powerful by the end of the 19th century, and thus represented a feudal threat to power, which had to respond by stripping it of that power either by co-opting it or else outright seizure of assets. He maintains that this has nothing whatsoever to do with ideology but is a pure function of power. In the end, calling it socialization or nationalization, the state strives to make its own all the great castles of the economic feudal system, the railway companies, the electricity distributing companies, and so on. Only those who know nothing of any time but their own, who are completely in the dark as to the manner of powers behaving through thousands of years, would regard these proceedings as the fruit of a particular set of doctrines. They are in fact the normal manifestations of power, and differ not at all in their nature from Henry VIII's confiscation of the wealth of the monasteries. The same principle is at work, the hunger for authority, the thirst for authorities, and in all these operations the same characteristics are present, including the rapid elevation of the dividers of the spoils. Whether it is socialist or whether it is not, power must always be at war with the capitalist authorities and despoil the capitalists of their accumulated wealth. In doing so it obeys the law of nature. Juvenal did not only have in mind the USSR or Nazi Germany, but also the USA. From Theodore Roosevelt to Franklin D. Roosevelt, capitalists had to be tamed and disciplined by power. By the end of World War II, it had been almost entirely successful in this, but at a cost. By heavily regulating hitherto private companies, power had created massive corporations which were, as Bond emphasizes, total creations of the law, entirely dependent on the state for their existence. Juvenal called this state of affairs syndicalist feudalism, which had grown to such gargantuan proportions that it presented power with a problem: will political power, after beating capitalist feudalism with the help of syndicalist feudalism, now round on its ally? If it does not, it will be the syndicalist feudalisms, and not itself, which will exercise the vast powers committed to it by individuals. And the state then will be the public thing of the syndicalist feudalisms. It seems to me that this has come to pass. At the time of writing, when Joe Biden is the president of the USA, it strikes me that he is the public thing of much larger entities that have effective power. Syndicalist feudalisms have in many respects not only merged with the state but also usurped it as the central node of authority. The investment firms BlackRock and Vanguard have over $9 trillion and $7 trillion in assets respectively. The most well-known corporate brand leaders typically enjoy over 70% market share in their specialist product lines, with the second biggest brand taking the bulk of the rest of the pie, creating effective duopolies in many markets. These corporate machines in turn fund massive and extremely influential non-government organizations, NGOs, and lobby groups, as well as exercising a near-total dominance of the media. It is quite clear that democratic political leaders are today merely showmen, and that effective sovereignty, in Schmitt's terms, lies in the syndicalist nexus. Since the power has become unmistakably corporate and globalist, unmoored from any national state, it becomes ravenous in its search for independent rival powers and demands obedience, becoming distinctly totalitarian. At the time of writing, we have been suffering the COVID-19 pandemic for almost 2 years. Scarcely any media organizations will speak out against harsh governmental restrictions. The media does the bidding of power without question. Corporations walk in lockstep, carrying the same message, actively censoring countervailing voices. We are experiencing the greatest wealth transfer from the middle class to elites in history. From the start of the pandemic to April 2021, Amazon's profits increased by 220% as many small and medium firms closed, and the public experienced record inflation. The failure of power to check syndicalist feudalisms has come to pass, and now the tail wags the dog. Where will it end? In the destruction of all other command for the benefit of one alone, that of the state. In each man's absolute freedom from every family and social authority, a freedom the price of which is complete submission to the state. In the complete equality as between themselves of all citizens, paid for by their equal abasement before the power of their absolute master, the state. In the disappearance of every constraint which does not emanate from the state, and in the denial of every preeminence which is not approved by the state. In a word, it ends in the atomization of society, and in the rupture of every private tie linking man and man, whose only bond is now their common bondage to the state. The extremes of individualism and socialism meet. That was their predestined course. If we are not there yet, it certainly feels that way. Historically, if power is seen as rotten to the core, revolution beckons. Juvenal devotes an entire chapter to revolutions. He argues that historians typically misunderstand revolutions because they are violent and therefore treated as in some way exceptional. He maintains, however, that revolutions too conform to his model. He remarks on the fact that most revolutions result in a system with a stronger central power than before the Rapids. There was a rule of a Charles I, a Louis XVI, a Nicholas II. After them, that of a Cromwell, a Napoleon, a Stalin. The Cromwells and Stalins are no fortuitous consequence, no accidental happening, of the revolutionary tempest. Rather they are its predestined goal, towards which the entire upheaval was moving inevitably. The cycle began with the downfall of an inadequate power only to close with the consolidation of a more absolute power. For Juvenal, revolution is the consequence of a weakness in power which is liquidated by a stronger one. The incumbent power will be weary and skeptical, worn out, inspiring modest respect, and with no more than a faded authority left to it, what Juvenal calls a nerveless scarecrow. How does a revolution happen? It is typically, and this has more than an echo of Pareto's foxes and lions about it, a refusal to use force on the part of power. Did the people rise against Louis XIV? No, but against the good-natured Louis XVI, who had not even the nerve to let his Swiss guards open fire. Against Peter the Great? No, but against the weakling Nicholas II, who did not dare avenge his beloved Rasputin. Against the old bluebird, Henry VIII? No, but against Charles I, who, after a few fitful attempts at governing, had resigned himself to living in a small way and was no danger to anyone. The moment of truth for any regime will come at the moment in which ideological soft power is stripped away and it must use repressive force to crush its opposition. Hesitancy on the part of power at the hour of decision, whether through a failure of nerve in the leadership or a failure in confidence on the part of their generals, will seal their fate if rival aristocrats exploit popular discontent. What is the benefit of reading Juvenal? What can he give us that we cannot find in the elite theorists or in Schmitt? I believe he gives us a dynamic model of change that is somewhat taken for granted in the other thinkers. Mosca discusses the tendency towards feudalism or towards bureaucratization, but does not explain how a society transitions from one state to the next, or indeed, why a Juvenal does. Pareto outlines his circulation of elites, and the predominance of foxes or lions in the ruling class, but he does not give us the exact mechanism through which this happens. Juvenal does. Schmitt states that every sovereign must declare its friends and enemies, but Juvenal provides a rationale for who might be the sovereign's enemy at any given point. For example, in 2021, the U.S. federal government, the public face of the aforementioned syndicalist nexus of finance, corporations, and NGOs, has declared that white supremacists constitute the highest terrorist threat to the country. Former President George W. Bush even argued they belong in the same breath as ISIS and that, in a statement as Schmittian as any ever uttered, bigotry and white supremacy are blasphemy against the American creed. The media daily propagandizes against white privilege, explains why white people are the problem. But why would power focus so heavily on this group, white people? It is because it comprises people who are independent of the state, would-be aristocrats, subsidiaries in potential, and even a few truly independent institutions, and therefore represents the largest threat to its hegemony. This was embodied in the hated figure of Donald Trump, but since he was banished from the airwaves and social media, now it must take the form of a direct attack on the disobedient people themselves, especially if they have refused the vaccination against the pandemic, which is a very convenient proxy marker of friend or enemy to power. Juvenal as a guide would tell us two things. First, one way or the other, the hour of decision will come. Second, whatever order exists after this hour of decision will grant no more liberty than what came before. The game stays the same, only the players change.